Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing Antichrist. This film came out in 2009, I believe, and it was written and directed by Lars von Trier. Like most films that he's made where, they're very intimate and personal to him, this film came out of when he was hospitalized for a depressive episode. That's where he wrote it. And honestly, as I was watching the movie, I thought to myself, yeah, the origins of this movie have probably come from a really dark time in Lars von Trier's life. And the movie does have that kind of quality to it. It's very surrealistic. It feels almost like a fever dream where you can't take anything at a literal level. I will also say that when you're watching his films, and even the characters themselves that are experiencing, whatever's going on in the scenario in the film, in the story, we feel very connected to them, even though the characters themselves don't really have strong defining attributes and aren't very distinctive just as personalities. When you're watching, it's like your emotions are a rubber band and they're just being abnormally stretched in all these different directions, and they start to become dangerous directions, definitely exploring areas that maybe you might not be so comfortable going to just impulsively. And they're all at the very edge of the spectrum until they start to blend into one another. And once they blend, they're really distorting and they're contorting, they're subverting, turning themselves inside out until you begin to like gnaw and rip at them until there's some sort of enlightenment or something that you've gained from the experience. And I feel like a lot of his movies, especially these that are in the Depression series that he's made, they're right in that headspace. As I said, this is part of von Trier's Depression trilogy. This is the first installment. The other one came out in 2011, and that was Melancholia, and then later there was Nymphomaniac. I love the eccentric, very offbeat humor in Nymphomaniac. I think it was the most fully realized, kind of the satirical elements that it's dabbling in, particularly in Volume 1. I struggled a lot with the thinness of Melancholia, and I've seen it several times, and I've yet to find much to really appreciate beyond a lot of the meandering of it. But I think that this movie, the first one that he made, is probably his most controversial and unrelenting of the three films. And von Trier kind of makes it his business to be a sort of shock poet of the cinema. I know I've said that before. He's trying to do multiple things. He's obviously wanting this to be a very experimental kind of art house sort of experience, but he's packaging it in this sort of typical cabin in the woods horror trope. And then on top of that, you have all of these very ambitious themes that he's trying very hard to flesh out. He is an auteur that he's hard to describe. I'm often torn when I talk about him. I certainly have mixed feelings on almost all the films of his that I have seen, and I know I'm not alone in feeling that way. I also struggle with how I want to describe his work, especially to viewers. When you watch his films, and a lot of people feel this way, you feel so many conflicting emotions. You constantly feel a sense of unease and discomfort. And yet somehow with all of these sort of things blending together that don't seem to really match, they somehow work together. Just not in a way that is typical for you to feel. A lot of his movies are very oversaturated, very washed out, very ugly and sterile looking. And there's also a quality just to the art house nature of it where it's very pretentious, but it's pretentious in a way where it's so laughable and it becomes kind of entertainment, as if he's sort of satirizing the experiment itself. There are points in this movie where you want to avert your gaze, where you feel maybe a little bit awkward and then feeling gut-wrenching pain, boredom certainly, despair, disgust, humor, all within the same film, under the same web. There are so many overreaching metaphors and very overwrought ideas going into this movie where the intent to me doesn't quite match the ambition of it. And I often feel that way. I often feel like he's trying to tackle a lot of things at once, and rarely does it truly come to fruition in a way that's completely pleasing. Like I said, I think Nymphomaniac came the closest, just based on, I haven't seen it in a few years, but based on my recollections of it. With this movie as the first installment, I do see a lot of the flaws. I have a lot of questions. A lot of it doesn't quite come together for me. And yet I still really liked the film a lot. I found a lot to admire in it because it's that strange blend of feelings and that kind of like, what is this supposed to mean? And yet I'm impacted by it, that makes it such an unforgettable experience. With these two characters, because it's just a two-character piece here, it's like you're hanging on to one extreme emotion, almost like you're like on a cliff or something, and you're waiting for the next extreme emotion, conflicting emotion, to catch you. Thematically, it is kind of convoluted and very clunky, as you might assume from what I've said, and yet there is some sort of bizarre harmony to the nonsensical logic. You sort of buy into it despite all of the muddled execution, just because I think he is so captivating. But with this movie, the one question I gotta ask, and I will ask it to everyone who watches it beyond this point, is very simple, or it seems very simple, but what is this movie about? It seems like not a complicated question, but I think that it is, because I think that each person who watches this movie is going to take away something different, depending on where you are in your life, depending on your age, depending on your environment, depending on your gender. On a literal level, of course, this movie is about a married couple. And it's played by Charlotte Gainsbourg and Willem Dafoe. And in the beginning of the movie, the two are having sex, and they are really caught up in the act that they're not paying attention to their infant son, who ends up, I guess, falling out of a window or jumping out of a window, something like that, while they're in the middle of the act. And that's the first scene. It is very von Trier-esque from the very opening frame. It's like these slow motion black and white sequences of like the couple just like in this ecstasy, just like doing it. And then there's snow falling and the kid, it's like cutting between the couple having sex and the child like falling out the window with like this Handel aria playing in the background. Okay, I'm not laughing at like the scenario itself. Of course, it's a terrible situation, but I'm just laughing at like the von Trier-ness of it. It is so Lars von Trier. And you probably, if you were a fan of his, you're probably laughing too. And that's the thing, is this movie is constantly taking through all these different headspaces, and it's that humor and that kind of pompous, over-the-top filmmaking that feels unexpected. It takes you in so many weird directions, from the very grotesque and the grim, the very surreal and psychedelic is what that turns into. And yet it becomes brutal and primal again. And yet it is all rooted almost in like this Nordic folklore, which can be quite beautiful and quite entrancing in its own way. But what is the movie about? I still haven't really answered the question. As the film is starting to unfold, especially when they go into Eden, which is, you know, the forest where they stay in the cabin where the husband, who's a psychiatrist, decides he wants to try and treat his wife's depression. And the woods themselves are a sort of surrealistic Rorschach test, where the two characters are going into it to face their depression, to face their guilt, the toxicity that they feel within themselves and towards each other in their relationship. It's a meditation on all of that guilt and what it means to be human, constantly grappling with that desire and that hate. The title of the film, of course, is Antichrist. And yet the Antichrist idea, just as an emblem, it's not really delved into as you'd expect. Who is the Antichrist really? We're not sure. Is it something that is personified in one big idea? Is it really more the husband? Is it the wife? Is it more of an abstraction? And what is the satanic motivation really? Clearly, it's got a lot of biblical ideas going on in it. It's a modern retelling of Adam and Eve. And obviously the woods themselves are called Eden. It does have a lot of those fantasy childlike elements in it. It's got talking animals, each one representing a different phase of their depression. And I kind of like those parts. I know a lot of the people, or I've talked to some people who talk about how they always thought that was quite comical. And I do too. But I like that feeling because it again, it's a weird blend of emotions. It is quite humorous, but it's blended with this sort of childlike fantasy that's very enchanting, mixed with that like kind of dark, grotesque horror. It is very horror influenced, and in a way, I don't know if other people agree, but this movie really reminded me of Night of the Hunter, which is one of my favorite American films. It's a movie that's also using a lot of aesthetic ideas and symbolism that is derived from other films and other artistic movements, but he's doing it in a way, or like it's coming together in a way that is so off-kilter and different. It is eccentric, it is childlike and fantasy-like. It's also very much like German expressionist horror. It's just really hard to categorize and describe. One of the reasons why I honestly haven't gotten around to reviewing it is for that reason. It's tough. When it comes to Lars von Trier, in a way you kind of have to look at it almost as like un chien andalou, you know, something that's like if I'm thinking more about like the Salvador Dali and like Louis Buñuel mentality, where you've got all of these different images and symbols, and it is this kind of fever dream-like state. Maybe these images don't amount to anything, maybe they do. And I think with von Trier, though there's a lot that's complicated, it's also sometimes more simple than it seems. And a lot of these ideas, especially when you get into the talking animals and such, it does feel like you're not supposed to read that much into it. Otherwise, you're just going to end up, you know, going towards a lot of dead ends. All of those particular symbols, like the tree and the house and the woods and all of that, they are very basic ideas, laying the groundwork. It's schematic even, you might say, but I'm totally okay with that, mainly because the relationship between the husband and wife, though it is basic, and it's like a Rorschach test where you are kind of projecting yourself onto them, onto their relationship, and that is very interesting. For me, the most interesting part of the film. I know that when this film originally came out, it was surrounded by controversy, people calling it a very misogynistic film, and that von Trier himself is a misogynist. And it's like, I don't know, I think that that is a very simplistic reading of it, and it's kind of insulting to the work itself. This film does have misogynistic elements in it, but that's part of life. That's what makes it complicated. I think it's confronting those ideas. When I'm looking at these characters, both of them, I see it as a mix of repression as well as rebellion, and it's that give and take in that dynamic. I think that what von Trier captures really well, though, that what is the strength of this film is the dynamic between the two characters, the emotions between them. Like I said, they're not particularly interesting characters, nor are they that memorable as personalities, but that's not the point. While we watch them and while we feel the things they feel and project our own feelings onto it, it's like we are nudged in this crawl space that is between like this agonizing loss and this hatred and primal sexual desire. This is a concept that I think is one of the most interesting things about human nature, but it's often shied away from, but not here. A marriage, of course, is very tough to begin with, but when you add on top of it such a tragedy like this, it does change things. The times when it gets really rough and really messy, devastating, where you're coming to terms with all of that loss and that pain, that's where you start to lose a lot of the identity of your own and the intent in your heart. And all of that starts to get really foggy. You forget where your love and your feelings should be directed, and they begin to often get misguided. There's a scene towards the beginning that really encapsulated it for me. It's a scene where she wakes up from bed and starts beating her head very violently against a toilet seat. And of course, the husband gets up and like rushes to her, tries to stop her and calm her down. But in the midst of that, through that aggression, they begin to have sex, and then she bites him. I like how all the concepts come together just in that one very brief scene. It's that pain and her losing herself within that pain, not being able to distinguish life outside of that pain, but also looking for some sort of high to ride that pain, because pain does have almost like an intoxic, addictive quality that escalates the more that you experience it. And often riding that high means, you know, having toxic sex. And especially if it's with somebody that is closest to you, you can use them in that way. And that just eventually takes you back through that vicious cycle of toxic violence and pain when it's provoked, especially in a situation where this family is now broken. What is left? What is left that they have to serve each other? And do they still love each other? I see this movie partially, it's about, it's a portrait of a marriage that is ending. Someone that is going through a divorce, through the psychological trappings of this supernatural forest, through the filter of those religious themes. The wife was working on a thesis, and as she works on the thesis and does her research, she starts to come to all of these conclusions about the female species. She believes that women are ruled by Satan and that women are evil. And the husband thinks it's ridiculous. He's like, really? That's what you've been researching all this time? And he dismisses it. But that right there is a really huge thing. And it's a huge thing in a lot of relationships, is that kind of the power play and that condescension that he has there. The husband is a therapist, and he does want to help cure his wife. He believes that no other doctor knows her the way I do, and I can help her. And it does give him that control over her. And I don't think that's some sort of conscious thing where he's trying really hard to be like masculine and dominant on the surface. But I just think it's that natural paternal nature that's coming through the dominance. And often when you look at their dynamic, you do see he is like a father to her, and she almost seems like a little girl. Because she's been so crippled by this despair. She's scared of the woods, and he literally has to like take her and walk her through it, because exposure therapy it tends to be the best kind of therapy. But there is just a bit of condescension there, and it's not like overt or anything like that. I'd say it's pretty typical, but it does create sort of a wall and a gap between the two where that communication isn't quite there. And as they separate, she starts to become very disturbed herself. I mean, she's got all this mysterious darkness that is clouding her mind. And she starts to have very violent thoughts towards herself and then towards him. But on top of it, she's having all of these sexual feelings and urges that are blending into all of that, like I said before. And the husband at a certain point does not know how to rein it in, because it's like, yeah, this like demon is rising, this phoenix. For me, my main interpretation of it, and remember, this is just my interpretation, I'm not saying that it is right or wrong, it's just kind of how I saw the film based on my experiences. But I find her fascination with women being evil in that research is coming from her own self-loathing, her own self-harm, and her own depression. That's what it's manifesting itself into. I think she does feel very isolated and misunderstood. And when you have a lot of things to express inside, a lot of feelings that start to feel like they're out of control, there's a lot of turmoil and turbulence, and she's got a lot to express inside, but she can't really do it because the person on the outside is sort of controlling to her and sort of condescending to her. She remains the submissive woman as she's sort of expected to be. And that is ultimately how she starts to see herself. So in a way, it's like she's repressing herself. And all of those things that have been projected onto her by society or whatever, she's starting to internalize. And now after this incident happens, she's trapped by her own desperation. So she's turning it inward and then outward on to the man who she resents for controlling her. Does he deserve this? No, of course not. He seems like a perfectly fine individual for the most part, who's clearly flawed. But to me, that's kind of the tragedy of it. And I think it's interesting because it expresses the times, how all of this social structure, how everything seems to be fine, and how it can really be destroying somebody on the inside to the point where it leads to chaos. That is such an interesting thing. The man is not evil, nor is the woman evil in here, but they are both victims of it in their own sad ways. But as I said, there's so many ways to read this movie, and I would actually like to hear other people's interpretation of it based on how they viewed it, based on their own experiences as people. But this is more kind of what I took away from it emotionally, just on my initial first viewing. This idea, even though it is just nearly bursting with all of these ideas, it still finds a way to make a lot of things resonate, allows a lot of images to really settle in and stick with you. And it does tackle taboo subjects, like what I mentioned before. Another one it talks about, I think that's interesting, is therapy and wondering whether or not it's more helpful or if it is a hindrance. I think that that's also quite a complicated thing. How much of the discussion of psychology, the psychosis, really changes things? Can therapy bring somebody out of a dangerous state for real, consistently? Or is it all just kind of like a lot of lofty musings and things like that that reveal inner truths and kind of reveal the inner nuts and bolts of a person, but they don't really teach you how to fix them? This movie is such a trip. It is like Takeshi Miike's Audition combined with like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and it's got a lot of other things mixed in there as well, like Night of the Hunter, Ingmar Bergman. They all work together to become, yes, a very muddled, a very convoluted phantasmagoria. It's ridiculous yet powerful. It's funny yet poignant, illogical yet somehow it all makes sense. Even with the last shot, I was like, what is going on? You know, like I'm looking at it and it's like, I kind of get what it means, I do, but at the same time, it's like it doesn't seem to be really connected or rooted in anything. But the main idea here is meditation on submission versus dominance, which is a tale as old as time. It's a tale that's been around as long as men and women have been alive. Definitely something you should see if you are a big Von Trier fan, or if you're just like a real art house cinema fan, you like experimental stuff. If you're a fan of Tarkovsky movies or Gaspar Noé, Ingmar Bergman, as I've said, this is the kind of movie that's going to turn you on. It's right up your alley. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. All of my social media information is below. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.